Hey everyone, so this video is going to take a look at Parker's back, and I've got the image there from the previous PowerPoint for you to see. I wanted to, just take some time to talk through some of those themes that we looked at in the bigger picture, specifically in this story. The body and the marriage relationship dynamic, I think, are really important. And so I just want to share with you some of the things that I found interesting, the things that I think are worth pointing out. And I won't be able to go through all of them. I don't want this to take forever because I could talk about this story for a really long time. It's a really interesting story, and O'Connor does such an incredible job of painting this picture of this marital relationship, and two, the interactions of the body and the spirit and how the two of them are connected, especially through Parker. So I have lots of things I could say, and I'll try and condense it as much as possible, but mostly I just wanted to share my thoughts with you and the things that I really enjoyed. I'm going to use a lot of quotations to defend my thinking, and so there's going to be a bit of back and forth because I'm looking at this thematically. I'm not going to go through the story page by page and point things out. So if you could have your copy of the story with you, it's not quite as colorful as some of my notes from when I came and chatted with you guys a few weeks back, but I really enjoyed this story, and I have a lot of things that I would love to talk to you about. So here we go. The first topic that I want to address throughout the story comes back to the idea of the kissers and the smashers, which was that the East versus the West in 1054, where the Eastern Christians, the Byzantine Christians, were looking at icons as part of their experience of faith and worship, and the Western Christians were the smashers. They were the ones who felt that icons were actually idolatrous and were getting in between our ability to experience God and to worship him and interact with him, that they were a middleman and an unnecessary one, even a sinful one. So this element is so rich in this story between Sarah Ruth and Parker. Sarah Ruth is definitely a smasher, and Parker is definitely a kisser when it comes to icons. And I said Parker with his tattoos, he's all about the icons. Like on page 513, there's this line that says the only reason he worked was to pay for tattoos. Like, this is something that not only is it literally embodied on him, it's a part of his physical experience, but it is something that is essentially his motivating factor. It's his key identity pieces, all of these tattoos that he has. And also on page 513, when it's sharing the story about how Parker sees this man at the circus who's covered in tattoos, there's this line, quote, "It was as if a blind boy had been turned so gently in a different direction that he did not know his destination had been changed," end quote. So we see that tattoos for Parker actually have this spiritual experience for him, that they are a way of him finding his path, finding his identity, and we see that again and again throughout the story, especially near the end of the story where he finally gets his back tattooed, because throughout the beginning we see he has no interest in getting a tattoo that he can't see. This visibility, this visual connection is really important to him, and it isn't until his dissatisfaction levels rise so high that he is willing to put a tattoo on his back where he can't see it, and even more so, this is the first tattoo that is explicitly, at least that we're told, that's explicitly religious in nature. Now he's hoping to do it for Sarah Ruth's approval, though we see some different layers going on there as well, and I'll come back to that a little bit more later. So that's how Parker, he's a kisser of icons. He loves iconography and images and literally putting them on his body, where Sarah Ruth, contrasting, is adamantly against them. From the first moment that we see her and that she and Parker meet, he's got his, we're told he has his sleeves rolled up. And so she can see some of the tattoos on his arm. And on page 512, there's the quote, "The girl gazed at this," being his arm with the tattoos, "with an almost stupefied smile of shock, as if she had accidentally grasped a poisonous snake." And for us, there's a lot of religious imagery throughout the story. I hope that maybe a poisonous snake has some connection for you to Eden and the fall. And we immediately see that she has this very visceral reaction, like as if she had accidentally grasped a poisonous snake. There's this jerking back motion. She's appalled. She's aghast. It's negative, and a poisonous snake, like the snake in the garden, or the serpent in the garden. So there's this connection to sin and the fall as well. And she says on page 515, she's trying to figure out a way to express her dislike of Parker's tattoos. And she says, quote, "It's a heap of vanity, vanity of vanities," end quote, which is also a connection to Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities. And at this point, one of the things she also said, she points to the eagle tattoo on his arm, and she calls it a chicken. So there's this missing of the point, almost like you see that she doesn't clearly see the tattoos on him, whether it's willful and she actually knows it's an eagle and is just choosing to call it a chicken, or whether it is actually some sort of inability to clearly see the images on him. There's definitely this discrepancy between how the two of them feel about tattoos. So yeah, right from the beginning of their relationship, I said we see this polarization between the two. His tattoos define who he is, and yet they're something that Sarah Ruth is adamantly against. Like, it is sin. We see this dynamic of her trying to save him from himself, from the tattoos, from sin. And I love at the end of the story, and I'll come back to this again, where there's also this discrepancy between how Sarah Ruth thinks Parker views his tattoos and how Parker thinks Sarah Ruth views his tattoos. Because as Parker's going to get the tattoo on his back of God, that's what he tells the artist. I want God. I want the image of God. He says to the tattoo artist on page 525, quote, "She can't say that she don't like the looks of God," end quote. And that's what Parker seems to think Sarah Ruth's response will be to his tattoo. She can't say she doesn't like it. It's God, right? And yet, as a reader, we're going, no, she's not going to like it. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we can be so convinced of that a little bit later. And at the very end, I think this is such a poignant comment on the character of Sarah Ruth, on iconography, on idolatry, from O'Connor. She has this moment at the very end. It's one of the closing moments on page 529 before Parker goes outside. And when Parker shows her his back tattoo, which she's unwilling to look at, she will not look at it, he asks her, quote, "Don't you know who it is?" end quote. And Sarah Ruth's response, from without even looking at it, she says, quote, "No, who is it?" Sarah Ruth said. "It ain't anybody I know," end quote. That's on page 529. And you can see O'Connor is condemning Sarah Ruth and her faith, supposed faith. You get that sense that O'Connor is not willing to consider Sarah Ruth's faith real or true or good, because she doesn't know the image of God. She does not recognize who God is. I loved that moment. I thought it was incredible. Okay, so that's looking at this kissers and smashers division and dynamic between these two characters. One thing I just wanted to bring up right at the beginning, also that we see as part of this, just creating the images of who Sarah and Parker are, is looking at both of their names that I think are quite significant. So Sarah Ruth, her two names, they're both Old Testament women. So even then, like, it's pre-Christ, and there's a lot of implications that come with using Old Testament names, especially ones that we often associate, like Christ came in love and grace, and the Old Testament, there's this discrepancy between the love and grace of Christ and the God of the Old Testament that we see. one of the images that immediately came to mind in thinking of Sarah Ruth, the character in this story, and the character of Sarah in the Old Testament, is remembering when Sarah laughed when God told her that she would have a son in her old age. And I have a quote from Genesis 18, verse 15 in the King James Version. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he, being God, said, Nay, but thou didst laugh. And so there's this interaction we see between Sarah and God where she had laughed when she was told that she was going to bear a son in her old age, which we do know comes true with Isaac. And there's this interaction between her and God when he confronts her with her sin. And Sarah denies it. No, I did not laugh. She's afraid to be honest before God. And he calls her out. He speaks the truth and he says, no, but you did. And so you see this interesting interaction there in Genesis. I thought that added to our understanding maybe a little bit of Sarah Ruth in the story. And then for Parker, we find out that his initials are O.E. Parker and that he hates his names. He hates anyone knowing about them. There's a bit of a story partway through where he was working in the Navy and word leaked out and he almost killed a man for finding out his name and sharing it with people. And he does share it with Sarah Ruth fairly early on in their relationship. But there's also a part, I don't think I actually made note of this, later in the story where he recognizes his name Obadiah, which is what the O stands for. And I made, this is on page 528. Parker bent down and put his mouth near the stuffed keyhole. So this is when he's trying to get into the house after having been gone for 2 days to get his tattoo. And Sarah Ruth's not letting him in. And she keeps asking, who's there? And he keeps saying his name, Parker, O.E. Parker. And finally, he crouches down to the keyhole and he says, Obadiah, he whispered. And all at once, he felt the light pouring through him, turning his spider-web soul into a perfect arabesque of colors, a garden of trees and birds and beasts. End quote. So there's almost this sense of naming his identity, of accepting his true self by saying his name later in the story. And this is when he has the tattoo where we've seen this shift in him. And Obadiah means servant of the Lord. And it's the book in the Bible, Obadiah. It's a minor prophet in the Old Testament. And the story itself is, it's the shortest book of the Bible. It's a single chapter, and it describes an encounter with God where, who is addressing Edom, it was a city being addressed at the time, their arrogance and the charges, and he charges them for their violent actions against their brother nation, which was Israel. And so, Parker steps into that identity. He steps into his name. And his second name, the E, is Elihu. And that means my God is he. And Elihu is also a character in the book of Job. And there's Job and there are his friends who we see these conversations back and forth. And Elihu is the character who is defending God's righteousness throughout the story. And so I think those names have a lot of power when we see these two characters and their dynamic and the identities that they take on. Okay, I'm going to pause here. I've got two more things, especially looking at the relationship dynamic and the role of the body, but I'll make a second video about that so that you don't have to keep listening to me right now. I'll be back.